And with me, in front of the CSOX label, is Mehmet Karli, who is my colleague and co-chair, and also the coordinator of the program on contemporary Turkey. And behind the CSOC logo is Julie Adams, who has been the organizer of this event, and will be also dealing with the technicalities. Now, as most of you know, our program has a long tradition on regional geopolitics, our study on the Balkans, Greek-Turkish relations, Cyprus, the Eastern Mediterranean. We have so many conflicts that we can deal with, more than we can chew. And the Eastern Mediterranean is actually the webinar that we will be discussing today. Of course, you don't need me to introduce you the topic. News on this front, on Greek-Turkish relations and Turkish-Cypriot relations at the moment, have been ongoing. They've been developing fast. They've been changing by the minute. And if you thought that we had escaped the warm episode and gone to exploratory talks between Turkey and Greece, well, we have to reconsider our assumptions, because developments are actually making prospects again uncertain, and maybe even more uncertain than before. So without further ado, I would like to very briefly present our three speakers who we are delighted to host in our first webinar at CSOX for this academic year. And we will be starting with Constantinos Filis, who is the executive director of the Institute of International Relations in Athens. He is an expert on energy and energy geopolitics. He is the author of numerous books, among others on Turkey and Russia. And he's one of the most recognizable figures in the Greek media, because he's constantly invited to comment and give analysis on the unexpected and expected twists and turns in the region. Constantinos has held many affiliations. One of them that I would like to point out is that he's been a visiting academic with us at CSOX and associate, and we worked together in the past. Then I would like to introduce Sinan Ulgen, who is the chairman of the Istanbul-based think tank Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies, and a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe in Brussels. Sinan has a Turkish Foreign Service background as a career diplomat, and in 1992 he was posted to the Turkish permanent delegation to the European Union in Brussels, where he became part of the team that negotiated the Turkey-EU customs union. And last but not least, because she requested Fiona Mullen to be third and promised to offer the silver lining and win-win solution in her talk, she's been providing independent economic analysis to an international audience for over 20 years. She founded Sapienta Economics in 2006 and is the author of the monthly Sapienta Country Analysis Cyprus. Fiona is the economic advisor to the United Nations Good Office's mission and has written extensively on the economics of a Cyprus settlement. I believe the panel is fabulous, extremely relevant, to tell us how they understand the current conundrum from their different points of views. On some final housekeeping notes, I would like to ask our three speakers, indeed I've already asked them, not to speak beyond 20 minutes each, in order to have ample time to engage in questions and answers, which is the section that my friend Mehmet Karli will be chairing after the speakers finish. I would also like to ask that you only use question and answer for your questions, and not the chat function, which will be used only by Julie, where she will be posting the brief bios of the three speakers. I would also like to ask our panelists to have their microphone off when they speak, muted for better quality. And I also want to say that the first part of our discussion is being recorded, but the question and answers is not going to be recorded. So with this, I would like to ask Constantinos to start his presentation, and I will be sharing his PowerPoint presentation with him.
Thanks, Othon. I would like to thank, of course, my good friend Othon Anastasakis, as well as the rest of the team at CISOX for the kind invitation and for facilitating our work in organizing today's event. I will be, during my first intervention, be sharing with you some thoughts on what is the state of affairs in the Eastern Mediterranean as a whole. I, of course, have the temptation to enter into Greek-Turkish relations, but I will leave that for the Q&A session. So, the Eastern Mediterranean is gaining momentum and the attention of the international community as numerous challenges, threats, and few opportunities are concentrated in the area. Namely, these are, Othon, if we can change slide. Can we change it? Okay, great. Migration and refugee flows, particularly after 2015, when we witnessed the largest wave in Europe since the Second World War. The migration issue will top the agenda for many years, and unfortunately, there are no easy or painless solutions to the problem. The number of refugees and economic migrants, the distinction is often unclear, coming from the wider Middle East and the northern swath of Africa, from Nigeria to Somalia, is large and will only get larger. Whether we like it or not, Europe's societies are not, for now, at least, willing to accept many more outsiders, especially from cultures very different from their own. The demagogues are obviously banking on social discontent and insecurity in times of crisis, when few people profit and many are afraid of losing. So the ranks of Orban, Le Pen, Salvini, and their friends are growing, and many of them are already inside the walls, already in power. The second, of course, challenge is jihadist terrorism. Since the US invasion in Iraq in 2003, we have seen a steady and wide shift of the terrorist network from Southeast Asia to the Middle East and Africa. Today, jihadist terrorism through ISIS, Daesh-affiliated groups, has spread its tentacles to Libya, Nigeria, Mali, and Sudan, among other countries. Obviously, the crisis in Syria and Libya create fertile ground for the terrorists, and despite the neutralization of ISIS, its fighters are still fighting as mercenaries in proxy wars from the Caucasus to the Horn of Africa. There are two big dangers here. Either a complete comeback from with territorial gains or control of regions through insurgencies, which is not the most probable, or their penetration of refugee migration flows to strengthen their cells in Europe. The third challenge is the coronavirus crisis and its economic repercussions, which will surely impact the region. Current and prospective Gulf state investments in Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, Jordan will fall. Tourism, one of the most lucrative sources of income in the region, has also been hit hard. Energy prices will drop, so states like Algeria, which is the EU's third biggest supplier of natural gas, LNG, and Egypt, which is the biggest, which is at the epicenter of energy developments in the Mediterranean, and for now the biggest producer, if we compare it with other Eastern Mediterranean countries, will also see its revenues shrinking significantly. So given that the crisis will hit weak economies and vulnerable population groups the hardest, it may act as a catalyst for political developments and social dynamics at a grassroots level. Consequently, security and by extension regional stability are directly linked with poverty levels, which will be exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis, and potential social reactions which may lead to uprisings. The stability of North African regimes may come into general question. Economic misery, after all, brought about a change in leadership in Libya only a few weeks ago. The fourth, of course, are the proxy wars that have been fought in the region as an additional cause for concern. The international community appears unable to intervene effectively. The US is obviously tired of its role as global policeman. Other Western powers, such as the EU, are unable to fill Washington's shoes, and powers bent on revising the international and regional systems, such as Russia, China, and Turkey, see the power vacuum as a window of opportunity. And we are also seeing a withdrawal from the institution building efforts that were mounted mainly during the George W. Bush presidency. Later on, under Obama, US foreign policy in the region was stigmatized by the Arab uprisings, the failed result of these uprisings, and the assassination of the US ambassador to Libya, which further shook Washington and vindicated those who were pushing for at least a partial withdrawal from the regional developments. Of course, Russia's return to regional power games through Syria and Libya, as well as China's strong economic footprint, are forcing the US to revise its approach. If we can change slide, please, Othon. Under the right conditions, energy could serve as a catalyst for developments. However, today, thanks at least in part to the pandemic, which has brought a sharp fall in oil prices, the situation is much more complicated. Let's look in general terms at why the Eastern Mediterranean is an interesting case for the European energy market security of supply. Here, diversification is the key word, diversification of both suppliers and transport routes. On average, the EU depends on Russia for 40% of its natural gas supply, and its alternatives are shrinking. So the comparative advantages of the Eastern Mediterranean are, as you can see on the slide, Azerbaijan's production, which is lower than expected in mid-1990s, when many thought that Azerbaijan was going to become the new Saudi Arabia of the Caspian Basin. This has not been the case. Sometimes numbers tell the truth. In the case of Azerbaijan, we can see that Azerbaijan produces something around 30 to 35 billion cubic meters on an annual basis, whereas Russia produces 640 billion cubic meters on an annual basis. So there is a huge difference. Azerbaijan cannot by any means replace Russia. Turkmenistan, which is another interesting option, it's on the eastern part of the Caspian Basin, is oriented towards the Asian market and particularly China. The Iranian option faces restrictions and complications, especially after US withdrawal from the agreement. This means that today, a French or a German company that would like to invest in Iran's hydrocarbons will face sanctions, and very hard sanctions, from the US. So given that Iran needs at least 7 to 10 years in order to modernize its energy facilities to be able to feed the European market, for now, Iran, unfortunately, I must stress, is out of the equation. And then we have, of course, the Kurdish part of Iraq, which is also affected by regional turbulence. And last, the American LNG will, of course, be directed to the European market, but will be mainly directed to Asia because there the profit is higher for companies. If we can change slide, Othon. However, due to COVID-19, energy companies will pull back on investments due to the outlook for recoupment, which is likely to result in delay, shelving, or even cancellation of plans. So time is not working in favor of regional producers. Oil prices are expected to remain low for the foreseeable future, with low demand strengthening this trend. So the Eastern Mediterranean's natural gas, with the exception of that of Egypt's Zohr deposit, will be facing competitive pricing problems. And what's more, of course, we are heading to a decarbonized economic model, not later than 2050. So time is certainly not working in favor of regional producers. Often, if we can change slide, please. Another interesting development has been the recognition of Israel by United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and with at least 5 Arab countries willing to follow the same path, a new regional landscape is taking shape. If Israel manages to restore its ties with the Arab world, the Palestinian cause, which is the creation of a Palestinian state, will be redefined, and countries like Turkey might be further marginalized. Here we can see 2 scenarios, not necessarily mutually exclusive. Either the US will attempt to secure its interests through a wider alliance, a wider synergy between Israel, the Arab states, maybe Greece, so that under its distant leadership, they can take charge of regional developments, or Washington is preparing the ground for a comeback and a more active role. It needs a more stable and predictable regional environment. The ultimate goal is obviously the containment of Russia and China. In the case of Russia, the US would like to close the rifts Moscow is using to strengthen its positions. And as for China, Washington's objective is to limit Beijing's economic footprint, which also translates into political leverage. Can we please change slide? I think it's the last one. I am not going to surprise you if I admit that the relations with Turkey are Greece's top priority, mainly due to Ankara's revisionism, but also because substantial integration of Turkey into the European family, which would have created a more predictable and controlled relationship, has remained elusive. However, developments on various levels in recent years, together with Athens' effort to evolve into a bridge of communication and understanding between Brussels and countries in the region, namely Egypt and Israel, have essentially determined the Greek agenda. To an equal extent, Greece wants to capitalize on its geographical position to become a hydrocarbon distribution hub, supplying the European market and mitigating its dependence on Russian natural gas. At the same time, after almost a decade of memoranda, Athens is looking for ways to restructure its economy and become a major commercial gateway to the EU and Southeast Europe. For Greece, Libya is a key parameter in the regional equation. As you know, in November 2019, Turkey and the government of Tripoli signed an agreement on the limitation of exclusive economic zones, an agreement that Athens has called illegal. Othon, do I have 1 minute? Great. The current stance of the EU and NATO on how to handle security challenges originating in the wider Mediterranean region is inadequate. If the EU wants to play a leading role on the global scale, it has to look beyond its own narrow boundaries and treat the Eastern Mediterranean as a single space of vital interest. But for now, both the EU's and NATO's attention are mainly directed to the eastern part of Europe and especially Russia. After all, and I will conclude with that, the stabilization of the Mediterranean depends on the acceptance of common rules of good neighborliness, respect for international law, and in the case of determining maritime borders, the international law of the sea, dialogue and cooperation between neighboring states, exploitation of mineral wealth, the prospects for which are waning due to the coronavirus crisis, and synergies on projects for the economic development and prosperity of the region. I think I'll stop here. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you very much, Constantinos. That was excellent mapping. And in 10 minutes, I have to say, we all admire your skill. And now we go straight to Sinan. And if I could ask Constantinos to mute himself and then Sinan to unmute. Thank you.
First of all, many thanks, Othon. Many thanks, Mehmet, for this invitation. It's a real pleasure for me to be part of this panel. What I intend to do in my 10 to 12 minutes is to give you a sense, mostly from a Turkish perspective, of how the dispute over the Eastern Mediterranean has evolved. Because really, I mean, the surprising thing is that ultimately the positions of the different stakeholders have been, very old positions. They have been held for most than 30, 40 years. They haven't really changed. But nonetheless, we find ourselves, in a peak moment, after 30, 40 years of the same held positions. So one question is really to understand what really drove this latest escalation. And secondly, I will try to give you a sense of where we might be heading under these circumstances. So let me start with the first question of, why this this crisis at this moment. Of course, as I said, the positions themselves have not changed, but something changed, which was, not a new phenomenon in itself, but obviously it's the discovery of offshore resources in the Eastern Mediterranean has raised the stakes. Before, it was a theoretical issue that has to do with, national sovereignty, namely where Turkish national sovereignty ends, where Greek national sovereignty begins, how do we share the continental shelf and the exclusive economic zones. But this question acquired a new dimension with the discovery of offshore resources, because then we could start to see concretely what the impact of this partition could be, and therefore being forestalled of these revenues might have as an economic consequence. So that was, the first dynamic that changed. Then what we've seen is also the evolution of Turkish foreign policy with some, ill-fated attempts to establish a position regionally after the Arab Spring, ended up in Turkey's diplomatic isolation in the region, and which produced a consortium of countries that have positioned themselves in a bid to establish a forum, the ISMED forum, by excluding Turkey. And therefore, this was seen in Ankara as a bid to establish a partnership that would leverage the offshore resources, again to the exclusion of Turkey, and Turkey has reacted to that. So that's been perhaps the second element of change, despite the fundamental positions that have remained immutable until now. As a result, Turkey also, and I think the third factor is the transformation of Turkish foreign policy towards a more assertive stance, towards a proclivity to rely more on hard power rather than on its soft power or its network of alliances. And the combination of these three factors really, I think, explain the latest turn of events where we have seen this escalation. But behind that, the reason why Ankara more and more relied on this, hard power tactics is also a willingness to communicate two messages. The first message is that Turkey will not allow whatever happens in terms of regional alliances. Turkey will not allow and will resort, if need be, on hard power to prevent the full realization of these, the commercialization of these offshore resources in a scenario where it's totally excluded from this. That's the first message that I think undergirds this proclivity for hard power. And the second message is particularly to Greece, is that, if Greece wants to take advantage commercially of these offshore resources, it needs to come to an agreement with Turkey. And therefore, the only way to do so is by way of bilateral negotiations with Turkey. So Greece cannot hope to put pressure on Turkey politically through the EU particularly, in order to get to a situation where it can hope to leverage these resources. So I think these are the two messages that Turkey was trying to communicate by relying on these more hard power tactics in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I think to some extent this strategy is paid off, because what we have seen is that these, exploratory talks between Turkey and Greece, which were suspended after the Boç coup attempt in Turkey in 2016, were about to restart. And here, I think I must commend the efforts of the German presidency. Germany has taken an active interest in this, unlike France, which sided itself blindly with the Greek position. But Germany tried to play the more neutral role. And it was through, the efforts of German diplomacy that in July of this year, Turkish and Greek delegations met in Berlin to sketch a roadmap, which would include direct talks between Athens and Ankara. Now, going forward, what may happen, I think we need to perhaps unpeel the layers of this dispute, because there are, three different geographical layers to this dispute. The first one relates to the Aegean, where, again, from the Turkish perspective, there are a host of bilateral issues with Greece. It's not just about the continental shelf. It's about territorial water. It's about demilitarization of the islands. It's about air traffic zones, and so on. And Turkey, therefore, wants to have a process where it can talk to Greece about the panoply of these disputes. Now, the Greek position, and I'm sure Constantinos will correct me if I'm wrong, but the Greek position is that many of these relate to the national sovereignty of Greece, and therefore that's not up for discussion. But in reality, they are, because that's basically what has been discussed for the past almost 40 years between Turkish and Greek authorities in what has been called exploratory talks. The reason why they are called exploratory talks is exactly that. It's to explore which dispute falls and, can be considered to be discussed between the two parties. And there's been more than actually just, 60 rounds of these talks. So, and these 60 rounds were not just about the continental shelf. They also explored ways to find a solution to the set of other disputes. So, and interestingly, the two sides had come very close to reaching an agreement on a host of these issues. Now, the solution was not, for some of them, the solution was a direct political settlement. For some of them, it was an agreement that basically they could, they would agree to disagree, but nonetheless, they would agree to take it to international adjudication, to international court. So I think it would be wrong to portray the Turkish position as being totally inimical to international adjudication. On the contrary, Turkey wants to go there, but assuming there is an agreement with Greece about both the specific disputes that they will be taken to international court, whether it's the International Court of Justice or the International Tribunal for Maritime Law, but nonetheless there needs to be a joint agreement on the set of disputes that they will be taken there. Secondly, there also needs to be an agreement on the legal norms that the parties will ask the International Tribunal to take into consideration. And here, of course, UNCLOS is one reference, but it's not the only reference. In addition to UNCLOS, for instance, Turkey may want to have other international law principles like equity to be taken into consideration by the International Court. But all of this to say that the way forward, no matter what happens on the, in terms of the tactics, is through bilateral negotiations. And these bilateral negotiations can lead to a partial solution. It can also lead to a joint agreement on the framework that will be submitted to international courts. That's as far as, the Aegean issues are concerned. That also includes the Eastern Med, where the main issue is about whether the island of Castellorizo has a continental shelf or not, and whether the islands in Crete and Rhodes, to what extent, what size of continental shelf they have, if not full, then what is the share? So those are the issues that relate. They're far simpler in a way than the panoply of disputes on the Aegean. And then we have the Cyprus question. The Cyprus question is obviously perhaps even more imponderable as things stand, given that we're still very far away from a political settlement in Cyprus, which is the core, perhaps the core issue as it relates also to the East Med problem, because it relates to how the mutual and opposing claims on the continental shelf of Cyprus, on the exclusive economic zone of Cyprus. Turkey has a formula that I think is nonetheless worth exploring, and that's the condominium formula. What the condominium formula is that Turkey claims that if we want to proceed, we can't condition this to a settlement in Cyprus. Of course, it would be ideal if we get to a settlement. But if we can't get to a settlement, at least we can explore a formula where the revenues from these offshore projects would be shared equitably between the two communities, the Turkish Cypriots and the Greek Cypriots. The Greek Cypriot answer to that is that they acknowledge this, because obviously Turkish Cypriots also have the rights to benefit from these offshore resources, but they continue to condition this to a political settlement. So the Greek Cypriot position is, as far as I understand correctly, is to put these revenues in an escrow account that will then be freed upon a political settlement. So there are these two options there. The Turkish offer that we shouldn't wait for a political settlement. If there is one, so much the better, but we can at least agree on a formula to share these revenues. Whereas on the Greek Cypriot side, I understand there's a concern that this formula could engender a tacit recognition of the Turkish entity, the TRNC, and therefore there is an obstacle to that. But I'm sure that maybe some creative formula can be found. And this is where perhaps I want to end my introductory remarks by putting out these different layers of the problem, and underlining that different diplomatic strategies would actually be needed if we want to find a lasting solution to the East Med disputes.
Thank you very much, Sinan, for making this Turkish perspective very clear to all of us. And now, since you stopped at Cyprus, we've got Fiona, who is on the island, and she can give us the perspective there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen now. You can see it, right? Good. Okay. So I'm not an academic, so I'm going to try and talk about solutions. I'm a consultant by profession, and what I want to look at today is, given all of the issues which the others spoke about, how do we reach a win-win situation in the East Med? And really my suggestions are targeted at international policymakers. So to do that, I'm first going to talk about what are the interests of the various players, then what scenarios might meet all of those interests, and then I have a couple of practical suggestions for how we get there. And let me start my stop clock so I'll make sure I don't overrun. What are the various interests of the players? At the EU level, obviously they want stable relations with Turkey, including migration cooperation. I think they want to avoid vetoes from the Republic of Cyprus or Greece in various external action areas. There's also other external action areas where the fact that there's the Cyprus problem means that you can't have NATO-EU cooperation. On the energy side, they want to cut emissions, diversify energy sources, and I flagged these because I think provide opportunities, they want to relaunch the EU as a modern digital green economy, and they want to demonstrate the EU's geopolitical credentials. And I think this is where a couple of opportunities might present themselves. What about the other big powers? The US obviously wants to keep Turkey on side, as it were. It wants stability in the East Med. I know one can argue about, are we talking the White House or the State Department? But I think certainly you will see even more if Biden wins. You're going to see pressure from the US for cooperation among all East Med countries. So that's the East Med gas forum countries plus Turkey. I've added Russia because obviously it wants to retain the foothold it already has over in Syria. Any deal that you have, you need to make sure at the very least it doesn't threaten Russia's interests. Otherwise, they are going to come and make, stymie it. And there's also, of course, Egyptian and Israeli interests, but I won't go into those right now. What are Greece and Turkey's interests? I think ultimately, as Sinan mentioned, ultimately they do want to be a legitimate player in the East Med. They think they've been taken for granted on migration, and I think before that in NATO. And we know that that they felt surrounded by the East Med gas forum developments. Greece obviously wants to avoid a military clash with Turkey in the short term. As Constantinos mentioned, they're developing themselves as a key energy player, not just they want to be able to develop their gas, but they're working on renewables as an LNG hub and so on and so forth. And obviously long term, they want stable, longer term relations with Turkey. What about the Cypriots? Greek Cypriots, in the short term, they want to be able to exploit their gas. It's been in the ground since 2011. There's, especially because of COVID, there's no real idea when that's going to get out of the ground. And the second one, I flagged it because this again could be an opportunity. I think the Greek Cypriots want to be the respected, this is their ambition, they want to be the respected EU player for the EU in the East Med. Obviously, Greece plays that to a certain extent, but Cyprus is physically located here. I think the Americans understand that, and I think they've used that as an incentive to get Cyprus to do some things it wants to do. The US wants it to do. I don't think the European Union has understood that yet or used it as a potential carrot. And then obviously it doesn't want to be pushed around by Turkey on land or in sea. Turkish Cypriots, really their primary aim is to have agency in their own affairs, which they don't really have at the moment. And they're concerned, they want to make sure in the context of a settlement that they do have agency. At the moment, they're asking for an equal place at the gas table, in addition to the revenue sharing that Sinan spoke about. And in the context of Cyprus settlement, they will want an equal place at the Cyprus table. So how do we get to scenarios that meet all of these interests? So my vision, as it were, is this grand, what I call the gas plus energy deal for the East Med. And it's important to make sure that there is something for everyone out of this deal. And how do you do it? You go beyond gas. You don't just focus on gas because, this might already be a dying resource. I mean, there's so much fuss about something which may not be commercially viable at all. So this involves gas and renewables. It involves electricity interconnectors. All of these things are already happening. So it's just a matter of, stitching them together. It could involve green hydrogen. I don't know, I'm not an energy expert, but Oxford University, you have the Oxford Institute on Energy must be around the corner from you. So that might be something to work on. And maybe there's communications infrastructure and defense. Again, that's not my area, but I'm sure if you put heads together, you could come up with some good solutions. And then that's all facilitated by low-cost finance from all these people who are desperately looking for, first of all, decent investments, and second of all, green investments. So that's people like the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, Private equity funds like BlackRock is trying to get more green. European Investment Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So what are the political parts of this deal? You would need Greece, Turkey to agree on maritime delimitation. I think you would need Turkey, as Sinan mentioned, Turkey wants to be part of this. So you would either need Turkey as a member of the East Med Gas Forum or a partner in the East Med Gas Forum. And I think to address the very deep mistrust between all sides at the moment, you need some mechanisms to ensure that everyone trusts that everyone else is going to behave and not do what everyone's been doing lately. You need, this is where I differ on the condominium approach. You need a settlement of the Cyprus problem. You need to fix the Cyprus problem. You're not going to fix the East Med if you don't fix the Cyprus problem, because it will always come back and be a problem. So how do you get the Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots to agree on a settlement? You do need to wave a lot of carrots at them, especially the Greek Cypriots, because there are very big psychological barriers to get over. I have lots of ideas about that, but I won't talk about them today. What does everyone gain if you have this big East Med deal? Obviously, you get peaceful East Med cooperation, maybe other spin-offs on Libya and other areas, which Constantinos mentioned. You get better relations between the EU and Turkey, Greece and Turkey, Cyprus and Turkey. The Cyprus problem is solved at long last. The EU gets to flex its geopolitical muscles. It also gets energy connections to the near abroad through the interconnectors. And importantly, and this is where, why is everybody fighting over gas? Because maybe it's disappearing as a fuel already. Everyone gets to exploit the gas before it's too late, before renewables take over. But if you involve renewables in this, they also get to prepare for the coming renewables revolution, which is really, really very close. So what are the obstacles to reaching reaching this? I think one of them is that so far, I think this is beginning to change. We have what I call a silo approach, that we say we'll deal with the gas problem over there, the Cyprus problem over here, and EU-Turkish relations over there. Obviously, Charles Michel, the president of the council, is trying to change that, I think, but they are linked. Then you're not going to solve the big problem without solving all of those problems. There's been a silo approach to energy. Everyone's talking only about gas. There is a lot more to do here. Let's expand the pie so there's something for everyone. And Greece, I think, can play a key role here because they understand it. They're doing LNG, they're doing renewables. They get that. And within the context of Cyprus, I think there's a certain amount of turf wars on the Cyprus problem. Whose job it is it to solve it? The EU makes an enormous contribution already on the technical side, already in the run-up to Crans-Montana, but also they're supporting the Turkish Cypriots to get ready for the day after. But I think there needs to be a little bit more flexibility on where can the EU have leverage and where can the UN have leverage. And within Cyprus, I'm getting a bit inside baseball here, but since the Annan plan, the UN's actual mandate has been a lot weaker. So, and I've been at the negotiating table. So, the UN is not able to present written papers, for example, and that's fine. It needs to be a Cypriot-owned process. But if you're not even actively chairing meetings, then an awful lot of time can be wasted. So I think a slight tweak of the UN's role, if negotiations restart, is needed. And then the Greek Cypriots have always said gas is not a Cyprus problem issue, it's our sovereign right as a Republic of Cyprus and so on. And so it gets difficult to solve anything there. And then there's another few issues on the Cyprus problem, but I won't talk about them now. I've got a minute and a half left. So how do we get everyone talking? We need to speak to everyone's interests. We need to facilitate their imaginations. So you need to help them see the vision, because once they see the vision, then the politics becomes much easier to get to the political deals, which, for example, Sinan was talking about. And in order to get that, you need all the international enablers to work together closely. So very practical suggestions is, I would say, don't start at the official level if you want everyone in EastMed. Start with people who aren't officials or who are there not in their official capacity, because if you try to get both, if you try to get Greek Cypriots, Turkish Cypriots and Turks and Greeks all at the table, you will waste 2 years fighting about recognition issues. Then, so while you're waiting for the political level to get together, you educate the political leaders about what's possible in EastMed. I think half of them don't even know what's going on in energy. They don't know what's possible. They don't know that gas may be a dead fuel. So use, you know, energy experts, companies, and so on. As I said, maybe maybe people around the corner, the Oxford Energy Institute, but you know, there's plenty of options to flesh out what might be commercially possible in the EastMed, and then you help the political leaders imagine this cooperative future. It makes everything else easier. And to do that, you need close cooperation of all the players at every working level. I think what you've had is good cooperation at the top and at the bottom, but not always, in my experience, cooperation in between. And that can lead to mistakes and mishaps, mixed messages and turf wars and so on. So to summarize, approach it by thinking about everyone's interests, think about how to build incentives into cooperation, work on a grand EastMed Gas Plus vision for the region. I think a job for the EU or US potentially is facilitate educations to create that vision. Don't leave anyone out. I say that because if you have a fully free market, energy market, you know, broad energy market for the region, Cyprus gets left out because it's too small to compete. So you need something which is what I call a mini OPEC. You don't want it as distortionary as OPEC, but you need to make sure that everybody gets a piece of the pie, because the purpose here is peace. And last but not least, be patient, plan well. I think if the EU rushes to a grand conference without doing its homework, without making sure everybody can see where we're going, then I think I worry it will blow up in their faces. So that's me finished. Just my shameless plug at the end. I do this every month, write about the Cyprus economy, the politics, the gas, and you can find it all on the internet, or you can always find me on Twitter. Thanks. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Fiona.